Find anything? I knew you were hiding something. You'd better have an ironclad explanation for this.
I don't know anything. Someone's trying to set me up.
Thanks for the help, Envoy. I think I can handle it from here.
Thanks for nothing.
Well, it's been a pretty slow start for game releases in 2025, with the recent Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 being really one of the first big titles we've had.
I believe you.
Now we've got another one to add to the list with Obsidian Entertainment's Avowed, an action role-playing game set in the Pillars of Eternity universe that was first showed off way back in 2020. And if you've been looking for that huge gangbuster game to sink your teeth into, well, then this ain't it.
Oh my.
Because while Avowed might have a few neat ideas here and there, it also feels incredibly dated and uninspired, with a lot of those early Skyrim comparisons that people made actually being quite accurate, considering this often feels like I'm playing something made in 2011.
Maybe you're not as dense as you look.
Right, so first things first, the premise is you're playing as the Envoy, a blank slate the player gets to customize and control, sent to the Living Lands by the Emperor of Adir to look into this dangerously spreading plague called the Dream Scourge. Now this is more or less like a fungal virus that takes over the mind and body of whatever it infects, and the player's initial goal is just to destroy this thing however possible, choosing to work with or not work with various factions across 4 different biomes, with each of these having an overarching main questline, along with an assortment of side missions and distractions along the way as well. Turns out though that the Dream Scourge actually has a bit of a consciousness of its own, and you can even end up allying with this thing instead in a roundabout sort of way, as well as potentially allying yourself with the Steel Garrote faction, who are simply trying to eradicate this thing and don't really care who they harm in the process.
We have no quarrel with you, but we are trying to be discreet.
So if nothing else, like it really does feel like you're being given this vast open world to explore. And there's definitely a great sense of exploration here, to the point that if you see something off in the distance, you can usually find your way up there to check it out.
Mostly.
Even at the starting area when you arrive in Dawnshore, like I thought I'd go and see if I could check out this nearby lighthouse, and not only could I fully climb up to the top of it, but there was even a chest up there that was full of loot. Then I could conveniently leap from the top of this thing and land safely in the water below. Avowed runs on the Unreal Engine 5, and I'd say that the environments look pretty good for the most part, in the sense that there's at least some kind of variety between each of these main zones, which does prevent things from looking repetitious. And performance-wise, outside of a few crashes to the desktop, the whole thing seems to run pretty well too. Which you would probably hope though, considering I'm running an RTX 4080, 30GB of RAM, and an i9 13900K. But it's just the art style and the general aesthetic that I really didn't find all that appealing. And the whole thing just feels so safe, like it's been designed by a focus group. Something that feels like it's been made to appeal to everyone, but also no one in particular, if that makes sense. After you begin a new game, for instance, you're treated to some of the all-time worst character presets I think I've ever seen, outside of maybe the Saints Row reboot.
God damn!
And in the lore, these deformities are supposed to be what happens when someone's being touched by the gods, with these physical aberrations being so-called blessings. And yeah, like I guess that's fine, but I genuinely can't imagine who would want to play through the entirety of this game looking like this. I mean, who's going to want to play this as a clicker from The Last of Us? Thankfully, you can toggle all of this stuff on or off. Your companions also serve as a bit of a milieu for the other species that inhabit Avowed's world. Kai, for instance, is the first one you meet, kinda looking like that guy in the Guinness World Records who turned himself into a human lizard.
Well, that's what I'm trying to nail down.
He's part of this aquatic race with an affinity for the ocean, and gameplay-wise, he's more or less a bit of a tank, able to take aggro from enemies and also revive himself. Secondly, you'll meet Marius, who's just a bit of a cookie-cutter dwarf. And this guy's basically like your assassin or ranger type, able to use powerful ranged attacks and also ensnare enemies in place with vines.
Take an earthquake.
Then you come across Giada, who's another human, and also by far, I think the most useful during combat, simply because she's the only companion who can actually heal you.
Come on, come on!
And while I don't think there's like a right or wrong companion to go with, I do think you're really missing out here by not having her in your party at all times. Simply because the benefit of that instant heal that restores 50% of your health, along with her other buffs, are just too hard to overlook. Then finally, you've got Yahtzee.
Oh, it's so exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, a bit of a sort of spellcaster, glass cannon kind of character. And I don't even know how to really describe her appearance either. I mean, it's kind of like if Gadget from Chip and Dale was redesigned for the modern age to make it look like she got offended by everything.
Careful, darling. I already have a lover. A good one. Skilled with his hands.
Oh god, now she's making weird sexual remarks.
Oh, a gentleman never tells. She's a feisty one. Almost makes me feel young again.
Oh god, now this guy's talking about having sex with her. Bruh.
Careful, darling.
Yeah, that kind of inadvertently brings me on to what I think is one of the weakest aspects to Avowed, and that's some of its writing and dialogue.
We locked him inside the house, but we don't know what to do.
Now, I know that this is set in the Pillars of Eternity universe, and it might be my fault in some regard there that I haven't played either of those games. In the sense that it is kind of like hopping into the third season of a TV series and expecting to be able to follow what's happening. But even still, like, Avowed should be able to tell a sensible and cohesive story for a newcomer. And I just often found that the writing is a complete mess, coming across very heavy-handed.
That sounds ominous.
With all these different factions, characters, regions, and other very crucial plot elements spoken about frequently in this constant regurgitation of exposition-heavy dialogue.
Well, to make a long story short, I think I can lead you to the garden. 30 years of research, and I think the answer lies in a ruin called Nakukubel, which is in Shatterscarp.
More than that though, a lot of the voice acting just really misses the mark.
A moment of your time, if you please.
Where quite a lot of the time as well, it's like the voice itself doesn't even really match up to what the character looks like.
You seem capable enough, stranger. But the forests are not safe. As if this weren't enough proof of that.
Margarete.
As in, it might be like a younger sounding voice on an older looking NPC or vice versa.
One less thing for me to worry about. Thank you. Enjoy your skates. One less thing for me to worry about. Thank you. Enjoy your skates. One less thing for me to worry about. Thank you. Enjoy your skates.
Find it really weird too how there's almost no profanity for 99% of the game, and then suddenly you hear someone drop an F-bomb or multiple F-bombs where it just really seems out of place.
Sorry for the mess, but it can't be helped. Not when a fucking horde of dream thralls screams up the path.
Not to mention why the Steel Garrote attacked my fucking home. Fuck.
You can also tell that the dialogue's been recorded separately from each actor, which is fine. I mean, it is kind of unrealistic to expect all the dialogue to be recorded with everyone in the same room. But what this also means is that it just sounds like everyone's having a discussion with themselves, and conversations don't really flow properly, often sounding disjointed.
Oh, that's a long story.
I know this joke gets thrown around a whole lot, but it really has those early Elder Scrolls games vibes, where it's kind of like two robots talking to each other trying to pass themselves off as a human.
Since when do you make the rules?
Since I arrived with the big sword.
Who wrote this drivel?
The facial animations are just outright bizarre as well, looking like things have been dialed up way too much, with certain faces being outright over-animated.
Before you ask, I know you're trying to find your supposed killer among the squad, and I really don't know much about it.
And then there's other times where their faces barely move at all, like they've overdosed on Botox.
I don't owe you any answers. Go away.
Every time I see this kind of thing going on with a modern game, it always makes me think back to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and how a 20-something-year-old game running on an unfinished version of the Source engine somehow more advanced and believable than a game made in 2025.
I was just thinking the same thing.
A lot of the random NPCs you come across also just look odd. Like they've been randomly generated and just thrown in there without a second thought. And check out this guy, for instance, who looks like JonTron. The way NPCs look at each other during conversations also looks weird and inhuman, with their eye lines often being way off as well. And I swear for a couple of the NPCs that they literally just used the exact same face presets and only changed around the outfit, the hair, and the skin color. And try to tell me that this is not the same person.
I am indeed.
But the cringiest thing by far here is all the various dialogue responses the player has, some of which are hilariously bad, coming across like Tumblr fanfiction, with these odd descriptions in brackets to describe the context of the response itself. Like this one here, put your hand on your weapon and raise your eyebrow. Nod solemnly and leave.
This is so fucking stupid.
Start to say something, then stop yourself. Or my personal favorite, smile dangerously. Yeah, smile dangerously. What the fuck does that even mean? How does someone smile dangerously?
I also like to live dangerously.
I mean, what's next, man? Teleports behind you and then says, nothing personal, kid?
One less thing for me to worry about.
Later in the game, I will admit that this stuff does seem to be toned down a bit, and there are some legitimately interesting moral choices to make as well. Stuff along the lines of, is it worth killing millions to save billions? There was a point where a random side character I saved during the prologue showed up again later on and actually helped to win a dispute in my favour.
Soldis, the envoy saved my life at Northreach.
And glad I am that you're here.
Thankfully, you don't have people telling you their pronouns or anything like that either. So yeah, it's not all bad. But the fact that 90% of the characters you interact with here are all just snarky assholes who talk down to the player, combined with these utterly embarrassing response options, makes one of the key components to the game, that being its writing, really come across as seeming kind of weak.
One less thing for me to worry about.
For something that's supposed to be a role-playing game, I was also surprised at just how little role-playing there actually is. Walking around the various towns, for instance, they may as well be empty because outside of the few merchants or NPCs you can interact with, everything else is just window dressing, with people all standing around idly to give the illusion of the place actually being bustling. You can't even attack the guards or the other NPCs with your weapons having no effect. You can't break into people's homes, you can't pickpocket anyone, and you can outright steal someone's belongings from right under their nose and they're not even gonna react.
Men need it.
I'm not climbing up there. The tower's barely standing.
Even the Elder Scrolls and the Fallout games would let you randomly attack otherwise friendly NPCs if you wanted to, forcing you to then pay the toll for your actions. And Morrowind had that infamous message if you locked a playthrough into a so-called doomed world, letting you still play on to experience that reality you created. But yeah, here we are in 2025 with a so-called AAA game that's been in development for half a decade, where things have regressed so much that any kind of genuine player freedom's just been completely removed.
Meanwhile...
Despite there being lockpicking in the game, all this is really based off is having actual lockpicks in your inventory. You don't need to put skill points into it or to beat any kind of minigame or anything like that. And even the highest level chests in the game can be opened in seconds, assuming you've got enough picks. Even with your inventory, the only items that even weigh anything are weapons and armor. And if you even come close to being full, you can instantly move something to your stash with the press of a button, totally removing the whole encumbrance aspect, which is a huge element to most RPGs. I can't even enjoy any basic puzzles or anything either, because as soon as I find an item I need to use, someone's gonna instantly blurt out what I need to do with it.
Bet that key opens the big double doors we saw on the way here.
During the sequence where you meet Maris for the first time, he's in the middle of an altercation at the local tavern, what seems like a pretty harmless argument between himself and a couple other patrons. And you've seen this kind of trope a million times before. It's where someone's getting outnumbered and wailed on, so you end up having to help the person out, which in turn is what gets them into your good graces. So I expected this to be a fun little distraction with a bar fight, maybe some jovial music in the background as I sent these bullies packing. Or maybe kind of like that one mission in Red Dead 2 when Arthur gets drunk with Lenny and they end up tearing the place apart. Only instead, it turned into a life or death fight, where I turned someone into fucking dust over a simple disagreement at the local bar.
Well, that was something.
An altercation that literally never comes up again for the rest of the game. No one ever chastises you for doing it, the city guard don't get involved, nothing. And I don't know, man, but anything would have been better than there being no consequences from me turning someone into vapor over a simple verbal disagreement.
Thanks, Marius. More blood to clean.
So the whole thing, like, it really feels like an RPG safe space.
All right. If you're willing to listen, then I'm willing to talk.
I was actually playing through Kingdom Come 2 last week, and coming to this after that, like, goddamn son, it really made me realize the difference between a role-playing game and an actual role-playing game.
Kurva, alright, shut up already.
Even the stealth here is completely trivialized, letting you hide in those magical knee-high patches of grass to remain invisible, and giving you this powerful backstab ability that can often kill enemies in a single hit. None of which you need to unlock, level up, or earn in any kind of meaningful way. It's just this super powerful stealth attack that everyone gets, which you can always use regardless of what your build is. And you could be wearing the heaviest set of armor in the game, and yet those thin patches of grass are going to somehow render you invisible. Finally brings me on to the main component, which is all the combat. And when it comes to that stuff, again, there is at least a fair few options there left up to the player, where what it mainly boils down to is if you're going to use melee weapons like swords or axes, ranged weapons like rifles and bows, or finally just all-out spells. You've got three main skill trees here with the fighter, ranger, and then finally wizard, which is the one I decided to go with, leaning heavily into stats like intellect and perception to really get the most benefit out of that tree. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with melee weapons, but the brief time I spent playing around with it really felt like I was trying to hammer down a tent peg with a Frankfurt sausage. And given the whole fantasy and magic setting and the fact that enemies drop mana essence on death, it just kind of felt to me like the game was leaning you towards spells over everything else. The prologue lets you mess around with all these different builds and weapon types so you can get an idea of the one you might want to stick with, but even then, respecking the skill tree is relatively cheap, costing only a couple of 100 gold coins, which is a drop in the ocean for the tens of thousands you're going to get during an actual playthrough. Regardless of what you go with, you've got a basic attack and a power attack, which is done by either pressing or holding down the attack button. If an enemy's blocking with a shield, then a power attack's going to knock them out of it. And underneath someone's health is their stun bar, which when filled up, lets you pull off this powerful combo move. Outside of that, the melee weapons don't really seem to have any unique attacks or combos. Like if you hold down the different directions when attacking or anything like that. It's either just your standard or power attack, combined with blocking and parrying. All of which drains your stamina, as does dodging, which regenerates quickly after a short delay. Weirdly too, the ranged weapons like rifles and bows don't actually use any kind of ammo, instead also just draining your stamina. Because I don't know, like I guess it would have been too much effort to add in actual different arrow or bullet types, which, you know, might have added some depth to the ranged combat.
Better weapon.
On a positive note, there are some neat ideas here in regards to how spells can interact with the environment. For instance, you can use fire spells to destroy vines that have blocked areas off, and ice spells or ice grenades can be thrown into the water to make temporary platforms. Yeah, something that Batman Arkham City pulled off 14 years ago. One of the earlier spells you can get holds enemies in place with vines, and even these can be upgraded to do poison damage over time. So yeah, like there are some fun options in there if you do go digging around in the skill trees. The thing is though, overall there's really not that much depth to the combat.
I'm sick.
Spells all have different elemental bases like fire, frost, lightning and poison, but pretty much all of these ever do is just add a damage over time effect when someone's hit by it. If enemies are standing in water, you can zap the water, which is going to make it more effective, which, yeah, is clever, but a lightning spell is still just a lightning spell, and it's going to achieve the same result just using more or less essence. Fire is still just going to slowly burn someone over time, and poison is still going to slowly poison them over time as well. About the only thing that it has going for it is if you freeze someone and then hit them with any kind of explosive attack, like a grenade, it'll do a whole heap of bonus damage. But really, that's about all the depth that it has with these various elements. And when I was playing through this, like, I couldn't help but think back to playing Bioshock, and how when you hit enemies in that game with a fire attack, how they'd often run into some nearby water to put themselves out. Where you could even then add insult to injury and quickly zap them with electricity for some bonus damage. Or again, looking back to Dark Messiah Might and Magic, and how the ice spells could make the ground all slippery and cause enemies to trip on their ass. And look, like I'm not saying that that should be a convention in every single game, but it was just another one of those moments that made me realize how creative and innovative games used to be. And now we've got something like this, where you blast someone in the face with a giant fireball and they barely react.
What the hell is that?
It also just results in this constant mess of different particle effects, explosions, and all this other visual noise, where you're decimating enemies with every single element known to man over and over. And I actually got flashbacks to playing Suicide Squad in that regard, where it was kind of similar in how they thought that having stuff constantly flashing across the screen would make up for what was otherwise a pretty mundane and repetitive system. Doesn't really help either that you can't really control aggro in this game, and once you're detected, pretty much every single bad guy in the tri-state area knows where you are. It's like you'll often just initiate combat with a couple of enemies, and then suddenly you've got a dozen of these guys coming at you as well. The most annoying ones in that regard, I think, are the scouts who just hang back from a distance and shoot at you constantly. As well as the priests, who are the healing type enemies, who you often won't even realize are in the fight until you notice someone's health bar suddenly getting instantly refilled. The enemy variety I didn't find all that interesting either, like it's just a whole lot of bandits, spiders, lizard men and bears. Yeah, seriously, there are so many fucking bears in this game. It's like every single enemy faction in the Living Lands has found a way to domesticate these things.
What is it? What's wrong, sister?
Oh yeah, and of course, all these different species and factions team up against the player. Rarely do they actually infight or focus on one another, because, yeah, that would have actually been interesting. But the shit that really brings my piss to a boil is how certain NPCs just randomly spawn in a whole bunch of other enemies for you to contend with. It's just never enough for you to be able to fight one at a time, and it seems every single mini-boss, boss, or named NPC forces you to deal with another 10 ads at the same time. So instead of it being about clever or creative fights based around studying attack patterns and learning when to dodge or stuff like that, it's really just about how quick you can kill all of these side bitches so you can focus on the main event. And look, like I really don't mind when games do this, if there's at least a purpose or a design principle behind it. I mean, the same thing happened a lot in Doom Eternal, for instance, but that was usually by design, because it was one of the many ways that the game lets you take control of your resources. But if it's just done here as a lame way to increase the illusion of genuine challenge, then it just comes across as tedious and frustrating. It's kind of like they figured, well, the player's got 2 AI buddies to help them out the entire time, so yeah, why not throw as many enemies as we want at them? This is where it does at least seem like your companions can make or break how well you do. Coming back to what I said before, how having Giada in your party really is a must. Marius I also thought was at least pretty handy there too, due to him also being able to pin enemies down with those magical vines, which, if nothing else, gave me some much needed breathing room. Especially when I was taking on more dudes at once than Lily Phillips. But even still, like with or without Giada, your primary method to staying alive, is to be constantly guzzling down health and essence potions, in between artificially pausing the game, well, to chomp down on an entire farmer's market's worth of food and drink. And none of which can be combined to make more powerful variants. Because yeah, like it's not like alchemy or cooking has ever been a mechanic in a fantasy game, has it?
Have you grounded? Good.
Fights can also be quite lengthy in Avowed as well, simply it seems because of how spongy some of the enemies are. Compared to some RPGs, enemies don't scale to the level of the player, which means there are areas and enemies you're going to be outright underleveled for. Instead of having numbers, it's instead based off the rarity system of loot, with enemies either being common, fine, exceptional, superb, and legend. Wait for it.
Wait for it.
Dairy.
Legendary!
And then the way it works is that if your gear is the same level as an enemy, you'll do normal damage. Whereas if it's higher or lower, you'll do more or less damage. Make sense?
Got the gist.
Which it seems they've done here to constantly encourage the player to keep their gear as upgraded as possible, to try to match whatever you're fighting. But it really wasn't until I was in the last couple of areas where it even felt like my gear could actually match what I was fighting, despite me spending a whole lot of time making sure I did every single side mission I could find, along with upgrading my items as much as I could. Even by the endgame area, where I'd more or less maxed out all of my gear and upgraded it as much as possible, some of the fights still went on and on, as enemies just soaked up all of my attacks like it was nothing. And this was all when I was playing on the normal difficulty, which, as far as I can tell, only seems to affect how much health everything else has. Considering there doesn't seem to be any benefit to playing on hard mode, in the sense that you're not getting better loot or more XP, along with there being no achievements for it either, it really just seems like a completely pointless option.
Let's see what you got.
What this system also means is that you can take a unique weapon or piece of armor you find early on in the game, and more or less use it for the entire story, as long as you keep upgrading it so it remains effective. And in fact, some armor that I found very early on was what I ended up wearing the entire time, simply because I just never came across anything else that had better stats.
Fine.
Honestly, by the end there, I was just begging for the whole thing to be over. And the last 2 or 3 hours of the story is really just fighting the same 2 or 3 enemy types over and over. Just when it seemed like it was about to end, it would put me in a new area, and I'll be off again given a whole different objective. And the only thing worse than a bad game, I think, is a mid one that just doesn't have the good sense to stop. And look, at the end of the day, I'm sure that some people are going to enjoy this one, and truthfully, it's not the worst game ever made, but I did just find it to be so utterly forgettable.
You can barely string a thought together.
And if it wasn't on Game Pass, then I doubt really anyone would even play it to begin with. There is nothing Avowed does that you haven't seen done before, and it just feels like the video game equivalent of copying someone else's homework and trying to pass it off as your own, only it's for an assignment that was due half a decade ago. Overall, it's the same problem I had with Outer Worlds in that it's not a bad experience, but just a painfully average one, and it just doesn't seem like it ever wants to take any risks.
Something to be said for that.
But if Obsidian want to keep making games that are actually worth playing and spending your time with, well, then they're gonna start to have to.
One less thing for me to worry about.